welcome. I appreciate all of you coming this evening. We have a number of things to talk about before we get started. First of all, many of you know Julie Enslow. She had a heart operation. Her heart was great. Every part of her heart was good, but she had to have a valve job. For those of you who have old cars, know about those. Anyways, but one valve, and it was fine. She came home from the hospital today. Hopefully she'll be able to take over this meeting next time, because I know she's raring to do that. A couple things to let you know before we get started. That's one thing. The second thing, there's a little bit of information that I got. Started out in the journal, and then I went online and got it. And this is from Moody's Investment Service. I don't know if you're familiar with Moody's Investment Service, right? Moody's for when a state or a local bit of government wants to borrow money to put in a new road, a school or something like that, Moody's gives them a rating. Moody's is now saying that climate change is forecast to heighten U.S. exposure to economic loss, placing short and long-term credit pressure on U.S. states and local government. The growing effects of climate change, including climbing global temperatures and rising sea levels, are forecast to have an increasing economic impact on U.S. state and local insurers. This will be a growing negative credit factor for issuers without sufficient adaptation and mitigation strategies. What this basically means is that local and state governments, if they're not doing something about climate change, if they're not mitigating or adapting, it's going to cost them more money when they want to buy get money for a bonding for streets or highways or those kinds of things. Moody's, they don't care about what's going on in Washington. They care about money. And the money is talking. So I thought that was an excellent piece of news. We try to do something. Moody's is going to take over and do a whole bunch more. Well, at this point, what we like to do, this issue of global warming obviously has got a lot of people concerned. The guy who really seems to know a lot about it, and he's spoken before our group before,
Stone's the name, rocks are my game.
That's it. Okay. And that's not to say, well, we won't get into any nefarious comments about that. Okay, I'm not going to talk anymore. George, why don't you take over?
Thanks for coming. First of all, I want to dedicate this presentation to Julie Enslow. Julie is such a pillar in this community for peace and environment, nature, so many great positive causes, and she's done such a magnificent job over many years at the Peace Action Center and here at 350.org at the Urban Ecology Center. So we've been praying for Julie, and the news seems very good, and I want to dedicate this talk to this outstanding woman. I also want to recognize another friend before I get started, and that's Philip Blank here in the front row. Philip, one-time meteorologist for the Air Force, still is a member of the American Meteorological Society, the AMS, and he still subscribes to the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, BAMS, which he shares with me very generously, and there's a lot of important stuff in there about climate change and weather, and so I want to recognize Philip as a dear friend. Well, this is about a month old. This is California. Record-breaking fires in California, as you know, following record-breaking droughts and heat waves, seriously affecting the agriculture, not only for the state of California, which has the 6th largest economy in the world, but also the agriculture for the whole country, and affecting prices and jobs, and very, very, very serious. We know about that. Western North America has experienced, I'm going to sit down here. It wouldn't do to fall over. Good. All of Western North America has experienced a tremendous increase in wildfires over the past few decades. Jennifer Pierce, Boise State University in Idaho, specializes in fires. She gave a paper 2 years ago reporting that the fire season in Western North America has increased by 90 days in the past 40 years. Now that's huge. Let's get to the title. Julie suggested this title, State of the World, so I thought maybe I could summarize that very quickly. That's the story, folks. Any questions? No. This was the 2016 National Climate Assessment published last August, and I'll just quickly read through this. The average temperature in the United States has risen rapidly and drastically since 1980, and recent decades have been the warmest of the past 1,500 years. Evidence for a changing climate abounds from the top of the atmosphere to the depths of the oceans. The authors note that thousands of studies conducted by tens of thousands of scientists have documented climate change on land and in the air. How do you document it? With data. Science is based on measurements, not opinions. Many lines of evidence demonstrate that human activities, especially emissions of greenhouse heat-trapping gases, are primarily responsible for recent observed climate change. Well, that's let's do a reality check. Anthropogenic, human caused climate changes and their impacts are real and are increasing. The principal causes are increasing greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide. Most of this CO2 derives from the combustion of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. Effective mitigation of future impacts requires major reductions in the combustion of fossil fuels. It's as simple as that. It's not a complex problem. But we're going, of course, in this country in just exactly the opposite direction right now. We'll discuss that a little later in the talk. Here's world energy consumption over the last 2 centuries since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and of course it's increased exponentially. Still is. Here's CO2 in the atmosphere. The latest information, now a good web page for this is called CO2 Earth. The latest monthly data is through November, and the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is measured in parts per million, has broken through the 400 parts per million barrier. James Hanson, some years ago, in an outstanding, significant landmark paper, noted that we needed to keep it down at 350, which is where this organization gets its name. 350 parts per million if we're going to assure the same kind of climate stability that we've been used to, that human civilization developed in. Thank you.
I think it'd be better to be seen.
Yeah, would you hold that for a minute? I'll hoist myself up here. Got farther to fall.
I know. You've got to be careful of you idols.
Thank you very much. As you can see, this lab on Mauna Loa, Phil Blank just got back from Hawaii. This lab on Mauna Loa was set up in 1957 by a graduate student of Roger Revelle at Harvard, Charles Keating, and the lab is still in full operation. As you can see, back in 1957, it was 318, I think, parts per million. It's increased 100 parts per million since then, and a steadily increasing curve. This is called very often the Keating Curve. What is it now, December? Here's the latest information. It's up to 406.75. January 6, 407.21. So it's continuing to rise rapidly. This is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Not only is it trapping more heat from the sun, but it's also dissolving in the oceans. When CO2 dissolves in water, it produces carbonic acid, and the pH of the oceans is going down because of this. It's killing coral reefs. It's threatening the base of the tree of life on the planet. The ocean acidification. It doesn't get much attention, but it's another effect of increasing CO2, ocean acidification, which threatens the entire marine life of the planet. It's the rate. Kevin Trenberth is a very distinguished meteorologist and climate researcher at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. This is his quote. I guess he's 50-something. He's been around a while and highly respected. Some of the human-induced changes are occurring 100 times faster than they occur in nature, Trenberth says. And this is one of the things that worries me more than climate change itself. It's actually the rate of change that is most worrying. Now, this is just some quick scans. Here's the temperature over the past century. This is the latest information on temperature from the National Climatic Data Center. January, November, the first 11 months of 2017, the third warmest such period in the 138-year record. The warmest, 2016 and 2015. But this was by far the warmest that was not influenced by El Nino or ENSO, the climatic phenomenon in the Pacific Ocean, which brings up cold water from deeper in the ocean and is another one of the principal drivers of temperature change at the surface. 2017 was the highest temperature for the planet that was not affected or influenced by El Nino. Well, come on. I'm not getting any response. Okay, good. With 1 month remaining, which is already passed now, that was December, the 2017 global land and ocean temperatures will likely end among the 3 highest years in the 138-year record and would be the warmest year with ENSO neutral conditions. Well, I already talked about that. Did I go too far? I got to get used to this. That's Katrina, those of you who recognized it. Now, here's a summary of the problem. As fossil carbon is transferred at accelerating rates from natural subsurface sequestration. What's natural subsurface sequestration? Coal, oil, and natural gas. To accumulations in the atmosphere and hydrosphere, the many impacts of this unnaturally rapid chemical redistribution are becoming increasingly problematic, to say the least, and are already stressing most of our planet's ecosystems, including the habitats of hundreds of millions of people, especially along coastlines. This is a real, serious problem now. That's Katrina. Magnificent photograph. It was the best tropical storm photograph I could find. This was when it was a Category 5 maximum sustained winds of 165 miles per hour around the high wall before it went north and came ashore east of New Orleans. But we had a lot of hurricanes this year. What's happening is the surface temperature of the ocean, the SSTs as they call them, sea surface temperatures, are increasing. In fact, ocean temperatures are increasing at virtually every depth. We've been surprised in recent years at the rise in temperature at significant depth in the ocean. This heat is being redistributed throughout the ocean, and the inertia, the thermal inertia of the ocean is great. You know, it takes a long time for bodies of water to change temperature. This is a recent report. The U.S. has sustained 219 weather and climate disasters since 1980, where overall damage costs reached or exceeded $1 billion. The total cost of these 219 events now exceeds $1.5 trillion. That's about the increase in the national debt from this so-called tax reform bill, which is really a transfer of funds to the top 1% of wealthiest people. This total now includes the initial cost estimates for hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. We had some heavy-duty tropical storms this year, a tremendous amount of damage, and these climate scientists consider impacts of global warming because the sea surface temperature is much warmer. It evaporates more moisture, more water vapor into the atmosphere, which not only provides the moisture for precipitation, but it provides the latent energy, the energy that drives these storms. So as the sea surface temperatures increase, we can expect more and more. Not only is the ocean expanding and sea levels rising, and the glaciers are melting, adding fresh water and raising the sea level. So the storms surges are much greater because the sea level is higher. This recent storm, and especially Sandy a few years ago, caused tremendous amount of damage because of the higher sea level. They tried to outlaw sea level rise in North Carolina, but in 2017, this past year, there were 16 weather and climate disaster events with losses exceeding $1 billion in the United States. These events included 1 drought, 2 floodings, 1 freeze, 8 severe storms, 3 tropical cyclones, and 1 wildfire event. Each of these producing more than $1 billion in damage. Overall, these events resulted in the death of 362 people and had significant economic effects on the areas impacted. The 1980-2017, over this period of time, what is that, 37 years, annual average is 5.8 events. We had 16 this past year. The annual average for the most recent 5 years, 2013-2017, is 11.6 events. So the average is going up. We're getting more and more of these very costly impact events. Hey, Greg. Here's the 2017 billion-dollar events in the United States. You can see the 3 hurricanes down there along the southeast coast. Jim Hanson. I gave a paper on this subject at the Geological Society of America's annual meeting at the end of October in Seattle. I was chastising, picking up the torch from Hanson, I was chastising the scientists for not speaking out more. I mean, geophysicists warn us about volcanic eruptions. The seismographs on the sides of the volcano pick up the earthquakes when the magma is moving into the volcano. The tilt meters pick up the swelling and the inflation as the volcano swells up, and they issue warnings like they did at Mount St. Helens, and everybody's evacuated from the region. Meteorologists monitor closely and issue warnings about these tropical storms, evacuate whole states. How come we scientists don't issue warnings? Or scientists have a duty not only to monitor and report, but to warn and recommend. And too many of them are not participating in this. It's the most serious environmental threat facing humankind. Here's Jim Hanson addressing this subject. Several years ago, I wrote a paper on scientific reticence. I love that. Naively thinking that drawing attention to the phenomenon might ameliorate its incidence. It seems to me that scientific reticence is now greater than when I first wrote on the topic. The affliction is widespread and severe. Too many scientists are politically intimidated. Either they don't want to get into an argument or they don't want their funding cut off. It shouldn't be that way. We pay them to warn us. Unless recognized, it may severely diminish, this is scientific reticence, unless recognized, it may severely diminish our chances of averting dangerous climate change. Scientific reticence is dangerous and wrong, in my opinion. Here's Jim Hanson again. He is most passionate of all the climate scientists in the world. I think Jim Hanson has had the biggest effect. He grew up in a small town, Denison, Iowa. He's a Republican, but he's a responsible scientist. And he cares. He cares about future generations. I wish more scientists would follow his lead. The relevant scientific community, in our opinion, has been exercising self-censorship in its warning to the public about the danger of human-made climate change. It would be difficult to overstate the threat. It would be difficult to overstate the threat of increasing human-made climate change, which we suggest threatens to bring about some of the greatest injustices in the history of the planet. Who suffers the most from these climate change effects? The poor and the people in the southern hemisphere, people of color. And remember, half the world's population lives in Asia, and they're served by the rivers that rise in the Himalaya, and those glaciers that feed those rivers are disappearing. In the history of the planet, of current adult generations, and this is what Jim Hanson cares about especially, and we all do, intergenerational justice, he calls it. It's justice for future generations, of current adult generations to young people and future generations, and of people of the industrialized North to people of the South, as climate change is due mainly to emissions from nations at middle to high latitudes. We bear the responsibility. All human activity has a moral dimension. We were on a ship going to Antarctica a few years ago. I made this comment, and some guy said, well, I guess that makes me immoral. And somebody next to him said, no, amoral. And this turns out this is a guy, an oil guy from Spring, Texas, just north of Houston. To say that he doesn't subscribe, I guess that makes me immoral, he said. Can you believe it? But that gives you a view into the mindset of a lot of these people. Remember, capitalism has no conscience. That's why we need legislation and regulation to control it. Capitalism got along fine with Nazi Germany. In fact, fascism, totalitarian government, is the most effective kind of government for building up profits. Capitalism's getting along fine in China. Capitalism got along fine in pre-Civil War United States with slavery. Capitalism is not democracy. Capitalism has no conscience. We must control it. Now, I love this quote because it's by two climate scientists. A fundamental principle of a civilized society is to protect people from harm done by others. If we are to call ourselves a civilized species, there is nothing for it but to change the way we produce and consume energy. There it is in a nutshell. David Archer is at the University of Chicago. A distinguished climate scientist, Stefan Ramstorff, is over at the University of Potsdam in Germany. Now, this guy became very well known a couple of years ago. Marc Edwards, he's an engineer from VPI, from Virginia Tech, and he was in charge of the study and the report on the Flint, Michigan water. In September 2015, a team working under Dr. Marc Edwards, and you'll see the point of this in just a moment, an engineering professor at Virginia Tech and an expert on municipal water quality, published a report finding extremely high levels of lead in the municipal water supply of Flint, Michigan. We know about that. Professor Edwards, and I want a side comment here, generally speaking, engineers are pretty conservative, but they're also honest and responsible, and that's what motivates this man's, Professor Edwards' comments. It was the injustice of it all, and the very agencies that are paid to protect these residents from lead in water knew or should have known after June at the very, very latest of this year, and that would be 2015, that federal law was not being followed in Flint, and that these children and residents were not being protected. And the extent, here's the most important point here, the extent to which they went to cover this up exposes a new level of arrogance and uncaring that I have never encountered. This applies to global warming just as well. We're kowtowing to the fossil fuel industry, the most profitable industry in the history of civilization. The fossil fuel industry is running our government. Why is it that ExxonMobil, just to put in an aside here, why is it that ExxonMobil, whose CEO is now our Secretary of State, why is it that a company that makes $30 to $40 billion a year profit, why is it that we, Joe taxpayer, is subsidizing that company and all the other big oil companies? They can write off their expenses for oil and gas exploration. Why are we subsidizing these hugely profitable countries? Because they own our government.
Money in politics.
Yeah, well, it's wrong. We got to get the money out of politics, Mary, and you're leading the way here locally.
Yep.
Thank you. Oh, this is a little bit more subtle, but it gets to the point of we're approaching unknown tipping points. If these processes of warming and all the feedbacks that contribute to it are not mitigated, there is a danger of passing that they will become irreversible. There's a danger that these processes will become unstoppable, uncontrollable, irreversible, and that's what this is about. Inertia of the climate system reduces present climate impacts, but it also, and you know, inertia is tendency not to change. It also makes it difficult to stop larger ones that in decades ahead. Inertia in our energy systems implies that it takes decades to make major changes in emissions and atmospheric composition. Well, come on. Because of the combination of these two slow systems, we are in danger of passing points of no return. That's what some people refer to as tipping points. That's when these processes become uncontrollable or irreversible. Such that we hand young people a climate system with great consequences, including the potential for large sea level rise and shutdown of the oceans, overturning circulations. Consequences that could be locked in soon if we do not reduce global emissions rapidly. Climate scientists like James Hanson, who know this stuff inside out, they have a real sense of urgency. You know, we don't have any time to waste. What are we doing? Exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. We're turning our back on the problem when it's becoming more and more urgent all the time. This is about fundamental responsibility and values, of course, which drives everything. This is from this is 1992 at the Earth Summit down in Rio de Janeiro, when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was formed, and they've been having annual meetings every year. The famous one 2 years ago in Paris, which Eileen and I attended, was called COP21, Conference of the Parties number 21. They've had 22 and 23 this year in Bonn, Germany. I'll refer to that a little bit later on. But in the original charter of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it states the purpose is to achieve, in accordance with relevant provisions of the convention, stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Well, we're already in the range of dangerous anthropogenic. Here's COP21 over in Paris, Le Bourget, a northeast suburb. Well, okay, here's COP23 at Bonn. At the USC now, President Trump had already announced that we're pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So the, shall we say, enlightened and responsible people in the American delegation set up their own booth and formed their own new organization under the leadership primarily of Governor Jerry Brown. At the U.S., California has played a leading role in the mitigation of climate change. Even way back in 2006, on September 17th, Governor Schwarzenegger signed Assembly Bill 32 in California. Assembly Bill 32 is the most ambitious legislation to address climate change yet passed anywhere in the world. It commits California to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. Now, that's if we can get the whole world to do that, we're well on our way to possibly controlling this problem. At the U.S., here at COP23 in Bonn, this is after we withdrew officially, according to President Trump. At the U.S. Climate Action Pavilion at COP23, America's Pledge, that's the name they've chosen for this organization. Co-chairs Michael Bloomberg and California Governor Jerry Brown released a new report, America's Pledge Phase 1. States, cities, and businesses in the United States are stepping up on climate action. The federal government won't do it with this idiot of a president, then we're going to do it in the state, local, and private sector. Oh, nobody called him an idiot. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Moron. Their America's Pledge report outlined how their coalition of cities, states, and businesses represented over half of the U.S. economy. So this group represents more than half the U.S. economy. At the report's packed launch event, Bloomberg even argued the group should be given a seat at the climate negotiating table. A second major event at this COP23, was the launch of the Powering Past Coal Alliance, led by the UK and Canada. That's because the EPA, under the direction of Scott Pruitt, who is nothing more than a shill for the oil industry in Oklahoma, Scott Pruitt canceled the Clean Power Plan. So these, the UK and Canada are picking it up, at least in their countries. Now here's the America's Pledge group. You can see Jerry Brown on the right, and Bloomberg is second from the left in the front row. And I apologize, I don't know the other participants. Go online and find America's Pledge and sign up. North American Climate Summit. This was in Chicago back in December. After the Bonn meeting, after COP23 in Bonn, Germany, more than 50 mayors from around the world, including Tom Barrett, including 36 from the United States, have gathered. Tom Barrett's had a pretty good record in supporting mitigation of climate change. I've worked with him over a number of years with the Sustainability Summit, and on that subject he gets pretty good grades. Have gathered at the North American Climate Summit and signed the Chicago Climate Charter, a first-of-its-kind international charter on climate change that seeks to allow cities to commit to the Paris Climate Agreement. By signing the charter, mayors are committing to the following general provisions. Achieve reduction in carbon emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. Quantify, track, and publicly report city emissions. Include groups traditionally underrepresented in climate policy. And be inclusive. Incorporate the realities of climate change and its impacts into local infrastructure and emergency planning. This is just common sense. Support strong regional, state, and federal policies and partnerships, as well as private sector initiatives that incentivize the transition to a new climate economy. I'll give JCI Johnson Controls, which is the largest corporation in Wisconsin, one of the Fortune 100 companies, I'll give them pretty good grades. They generally support this. Of course, one of the products they sell are building controls, which regulate the internal climate. We need to get more private sector action. This is the Chicago meeting. I think Tom Barrett is in the back row. Maybe you can spot him. This was the Rahm Emanuel show. He's the mayor of Chicago, and that's what Tom Barrett called it, the Rahm Emanuel show. Here's Jerry Brown. This is a major conference next September. I encourage all of you to look it up and find out about it at least, even if you can't go. September 12th through 14th, next September. Come join us, entrepreneurs, singers, musicians, mathematicians. See, it's going to be fun. Professors, students. My son lives in San Francisco. We need people that represent the whole world, because this is about the whole world and the people who live here. It's time to act. It's time to join together. That's why at this Climate Action Summit, we're going to get it done. Jerry Brown. Hey, we need to. Now here, I was going to put this in where they come in one at a time. I apologize. I didn't get back. These are some of the changes in the past year, 2017, under the Trump administration. Drops climate change from the list of national security threats. Let me tell you about that. The Pentagon, the U.S. Department of Defense, in its last two quadrennial reports, which came out in 2010 and 2014. The next one will be out this coming year, but I bet it'll be censored. In those two quadrennial reports by the Defense Department, they cited climate change as a national security risk. Climate change is causing more problems for food supply, agriculture, water supply. It's forcing people to migrate because of changing climates. It's destabilizing, such as in the Middle East. It was a factor in the development of ISIS and the Syrian war. The Defense Department listed climate change as a national security threat in its two last quadrennial reports. Well, the Trump administration has dropped that. That's no longer a national security threat. Why is that? They're worried about their Norfolk naval base, the biggest naval base in the world, and the rising sea level is causing all kinds of problems for them there. That's why they're concerned about climate change, in addition to its effect on other people. December 4th, downsize 2 national monuments. Well, you know about that. Allow drilling in Anwar, December 2nd. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Environmentalists, people who care about the land and its resources and the wildlife, we've been fighting this off for decades, and successfully. And now Trump is going to approve drilling there. And of course, no Republicans have the backbone to stand up to him, no matter how outrageous or unjust or simply wrong some of the things he states and some of the policies he's back are. Nobody has the backbone. I really am angered by that. Why? Country over party. People over party. Come on. Let's demand that these people be responsible. Allow drilling in Anwar. Largest ever oil and gas lease auction proposed by Department Zimke, the new Department of Interior Secretary. EPA poised to scrap the Clean Power Plan. Well, I think it's scrapped. Mining health study halted. Climate advisory panel disbanded. Oh, who needs to know anything? Trump doesn't read anyway. And he doesn't listen either. If I seem politically angry, you cannot discuss this subject without being political. That's not my choice. It's the parties who have chosen because of their values. It gets down to values. It's the parties who have chosen the issues to back. And the Republicans oppose environmental and nature issues. They're more interested in profits than they are in preservation. What else? Revokes flood standards. EPA enforcement lags. Cancels, you can see the dates along here on the side. NOAA cancels rule to protect whales from fishing nets. U.S. pulls out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Trump budget proposes steep cuts for the environment. EPA dismisses science advisors. What do they need science advisors for? They got Scott Pruitt, who's an oil company shill from Oklahoma. EPA scrubs climate change website, just like our DNR here in Wisconsin. Why do we put up with that? Order aims to expand offshore drilling. All the governors, there was a report on the World News tonight, all the governors of the coastal states, the East Coast and the West Coast, oppose this. They don't want offshore drilling. Now, there's been a huge accident in the South China Sea 3 days ago where a gigantic tanker from Iran no, it was not. It was a transport of some kind from Iran. Ran into a gigantic mega oil tanker ship from China. It's on fire. It's been on fire for 3 days. It contains a million barrels. Now there are 42 gallons in a barrel. 1 million barrels of oil. It's on fire. They're afraid it might explode, and all that oil this would be many times the size of the Exxon oil spill up in the Gulf of Alaska. This is going on right now. The Trump administration has opposed the rules that were put into place after that blowout in the Gulf of Mexico. What did they call that? They're taking away the controls and the rules to prevent these kinds of huge disasters rather than adding to them. 40 national monuments to be reviewed. Well, we had the scientists march on Washington back on Earth Day. The Interior Department scrubbed its climate change website, just like the DNR here in Wisconsin. Climate change staffers were reassigned. People who've been working on climate change problems were reassigned to something else. XL Keystone Pipeline, of course, was approved by Trump. Streams reopened to mining waste. I mean, this is just a partial list, a horror list of what's going on under the Trump administration. Time to reassert environmental leadership. We're getting close to the end now, folks, so hang in there. Historically, the United States has led the world in conservation initiatives. I don't understand why conservatives don't recognize that conservative comes from conservation. You know, Teddy Roosevelt was kind of the father of conservation in this country. He was a Republican, a progressive Republican at that. But conservation means conserve. Conserve natural resources. Conserve all resources. Why don't the Republicans, why don't conservatives recognize their conservation heritage? They need to be reminded. No money in it. Yeah, you got that right. The United States has led the world in conservation initiatives from the establishment of the national parks, which started with Yellowstone, actually with Yosemite as a state park in 1864. But Clean Water Act, 1972, Endangered Species Act, Montreal Protocol, which is a great example of how the countries of the world came together to address the ozone depletion problem and came up with a solution banning the manufacture, the production of those CFCs which destroyed the ozone, and it was successful. It goes to show that a human impact on the atmosphere can be addressed internationally and can be brought under control. We led the way on that too. It's time to reclaim our conservation heritage and reassert national and international environmental leadership in addressing the world's most daunting geoscience challenge. What is that? Global warming. Politicians can ignore reality and responsibility. Scientists must not. And I would say all professionals, all informed citizens. It is a professional imperative for scientists to report, to warn, and to recommend. Whoops. Paul Wellstone, you know, he was the wonderful senator from Minnesota who was killed in a plane crash a few years ago and was succeeded by, well, Al Franken. Boy, what a bummer that was. Paul Wellstone. Well, he was the guiding inspiration. Paul Wellstone was the guiding inspiration for Al Franken. Here's what we need in 2018. We need a wave. We need to take over state houses, that is the legislatures and governorships. We need to take over, by we I mean the Democrats or the anti-Trumps. The United States House of Representatives and the Senate. We've got to stop this. 2020 is a census year. After that, all the state legislatures will be doing reapportionment. And unless we take over the majority of those state houses, there's going to be more and worse gerrymandering than exists now. There's every 10 years you get an opportunity for big-time gerrymandering. We have got to prevent that this year. 2018 is absolutely crucial. This is what we need. I don't care which organizations you belong to or which are your favorite topics. I know you're all good people and with humane values, concerned about human beings and nature. Whatever your organization, we've got to work together on this. We've got to come together on this, not bicker over slight differences. We have got to change our government. Who's this? Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright with the cane and the hat. I went to the University of Miami as an undergraduate, and one time I lived at home. My folks had moved down there in retirement. And one day on TV, the Gary Moore show, and some of you may have heard me tell this story before, Frank Lloyd Wright was the guest. And he turned to Gary Moore, and he had a kind of a big high collar and a mane of gray hair and a cane. And he looked much like this. And he turned to Gary Moore, who was the host of that talk show, and he says, "Young man, what is the greatest tradition?" Gary Moore looked like a deer in the headlights. You know, he turned to his sidekick, Durward Kirby, and Durward, do you know what he means, what he's getting at? Durward, sir. And Frank Lloyd Wright, running out of patience, he says, "Young man, the greatest tradition," if I can show this to you, "the greatest tradition is change." That's what we need. We need to change our government. And I couldn't be more serious or more passionate about it. I appeal to you to up your level of taking this seriously. 2018 has got to be a year of change. Thank you.
Daddy should have more passion.
Phil Blank says he should have more passion.
I don't think I could survive it. You know?
Your turn. Don Weischer has been involved with 350 for a long time.
I was involved in the first Earth Day, too.
Okay.
I just wanted to add, I know you've done this before, but to me, it seems like people aren't going to get involved until they actually, some of this affects them personally. And a lot of people are being affected personally, and they don't even know it, of course. But I think you've put statistics on before of how many people live close to the ocean in large cities, because many of the cities grew out of the commerce between countries and so forth. So I see if some of these cities start to have serious flooding and so forth, maybe that will galvanize, maybe it'll be too late, but it might galvanize people to change. Do you have some sense of what percentage of people live in these coastal cities, some of the largest cities in the world?
Well, in the United States, I think it's about a third. And some of the coastal cities are, of necessity, already doing things, such as Miami Beach is building seawalls. The hotels are going to be flooded out. New York, Hurricane Sandy, about 3-4 years ago, flooded all the tunnels going into New York City except for the Lincoln Tunnel, and flooded the subways. It flooded out the western end of Long Island there, where it goes over to New Jersey. They're building seawalls, and New York is trying to regulate. New York and New Jersey have been trying to get funding for a tunnel between New York and New Jersey. They haven't been able to get it funded by Congress. But some places are doing that already. The Japanese, they're way ahead of us as usual. The Japanese have been way ahead of us in a lot of areas, especially meteorology and seismology. Their trains, you know, earthquakes send out vibrations or waves, seismic waves of two types. The compressional waves are very fast moving and they arrive first. Then the shake waves, the shear waves, are slower moving and they arrive second. The Japanese have installed a system whereby as soon as the P waves arrive, the trains stop. Because the greater damage, the greater amount of shaking comes from the shear waves, the S waves, that arrive second. So they've had those systems in operation for a couple of decades.
And George, you've related some of the ocean, the rise in the oceans to the warming of the ocean.
That's right.
Water. You've given talks about that.
Yeah.
That's what I remember so strongly.
Well, there are two effects there. The warming of the ocean water just from thermal expansion causes the sea level to rise. About half of the sea level rise is due to that. And the rest is due to the melting of land glaciers. Not sea ice, because that's already part of the ocean, but land glaciers. And I mentioned Asia. In the Himalaya, a number of major rivers that provide fresh water for much of Asia rise in the Himalayas or the Himalaya. You've got, of course, the Indus that goes down through Pakistan, the Ganges, who comes around the west end of the Himalaya, runs across India, the Brahmaputra, which goes around the east end of the Himalaya, comes down through Bangladesh, and then the Irrawaddy in Myanmar or Burma, the Mekong over Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, the Hoang Ho and the Yangtze going across China. These are all major rivers upon which the civilization in Asia, which is half of the people in the world, depends. And the little glaciers up in the Himalayas that are melting and supplying fresh water to those rivers, they're disappearing. The future for those glaciers and that water supply for half of the world's population is bleak. We had a speaker at the Geological Society meeting in Seattle in October. In fact, in the session I co-chaired, Lonnie Thompson is a leading mountain glacier specialist from Ohio State University. And he just got back from 9 months in the Himalayas and reported that almost all the glaciers they're studying are melting back at an accelerating rate. Not good news.
I wanted to add on to that. I majored in a year in astronomy at the University of Wisconsin, and I studied about the Earth and the atmosphere. Now, getting back to what you were talking, glaciers and the water, there's a part of the Earth called, underneath the tectonic plates, called the Ring of Fire. The Ring of Fire is where is the core of the tectonic plates underneath the Earth. And scientists believe the Ring of Fire, or parts of the core of the Earth, will gradually increase to a high level where it will cause a wobble effect to the Earth tilting. Do you believe that will come in the years to come?
No. I think that is greatly exaggerated. And
is a theory, yes, correct.
Yeah, it's not supported by very many geoscientists. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry, in the back.
Okay, I have two comments. I went to a forum by a meteorologist at the Unitarian Church, and he stated that he was not allowed to talk about global warming in any of his meteorological reports. Everyone should call up every single weather channel and demand that they talk about it. The meteorologists are trying to do something, but I don't see anything happening. My other point is that why are we 350? We're out of date. We should be 450. We should have a press conference and announce it and the rationale as to why we've gone up to 450 instead of 350, and get lots of publicity with all of George's points in it. So that's all. Thanks.
Get in touch with Bill McKibben and suggest that name change. He's the founder of the organization.
One of the things that we often hear, these specific disastrous events, is that, well, you can't achieve. It's just a kind of a one-off, and you oftentimes do hear people saying, well, we don't really know if it had anything to do with climate change, it's just that this could just have been something that might have happened even without it. So how do you respond to those kinds of arguments?
With gusto, George, with gusto. Thank you for the question. The climate is the context for weather. It's as simple as that. And if the climate conditions change, it impacts the weather. To say that it has no connection, now you may not be able to draw, like in solving a crime, to draw a line-for-line connection with a particular weather event, but all weather takes place within the context of the climate, and that's what we're talking about. The climate, the temperature is getting warmer. There's more water vapor. There's 40% more water vapor in the atmosphere now than there was 40 years ago. No, I'm sorry. I got it mixed up. It's 5%. So let me correct that. 5% more water vapor in the atmosphere than there was 40 years ago. Well, why do you think we have all these huge flooding precipitation events? Because the sea surface temperature is higher, more evaporation, more moisture in the atmosphere, more precipitation. So that's nonsense. The climate is the context for weather events. This is basically the way Michael Mann, the famous climate scientist from Penn State, puts it. The climate is the context for weather events, and so all weather events are born of the climate system. So to say there's no connection is just a distraction trying to just distract away from it. Yes?
Just a second, let me get a microphone.
I've heard that if we just stop all pollution now, stop civilization, and wasn't here.
That first we get, the first effect would be that because we don't have the pollution, we don't have the global dimming effect, and then like in a week or two the temperature would go up. But would it continue to go up, and for how long? And there's all these delays. How does that, you know?
That's a good question. Greenhouse gas. Let me just give a simple model here of what's going on with the Earth. Here's planet Earth right here. The Earth has a positive heat balance. That means it's absorbing more heat radiation from the sun than it's radiating as back radiation, infrared radiation, back into space. We're absorbing more than we're radiating back. The greenhouse gases in the atmosphere absorb some of that back radiation, and that's the reason that we have a positive heat balance. So the Earth's heating up. It's absorbing more heat than it's radiating back. It's going to continue to warm. That's the problem in the simplest terms. But what was the second part of your question? Oh, yeah. Now, the greenhouse gases, the principal greenhouse gases, and we've known about this since the time of our Civil War, 1859, 1860. An Irish scientist, John Tyndall, did experiments in the laboratory in London to identify which were the gases that were trapping the heat. Not the main gases, oxygen and nitrogen. Infrared radiation goes right on through them. CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, there are many of those. CFCs, chlorofluorocarbon, these are the gases, the trace gases are the ones that absorb the infrared radiation. We've known about that. This was determined by experiment in the laboratory. We've known about that for 150 years. In 1893, Svante Arrhenius, a chemist in Sweden, a Swedish chemist, was worried about the Industrial Revolution and the burning of all the coal that was going on. He knew about Tyndall's results. He knew that carbon dioxide was a greenhouse gas, and he was worried that the burning of all the coal in the Industrial Revolution was going to increase the CO2 in the atmosphere sufficiently to warm up the planet. So he started calculating. And he calculated, and he said by the end of the 21st century, that's us, the average temperature of the globe would increase between 5 and 6 degrees Celsius. Now that's not all that far off what we're looking at right now. This was 1893. Incidentally, he won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1905 for his, he developed the theory of ionization of molecules. So we've known about this for a century and a quarter. We haven't done anything about an American engineer, Guy Collender, in 1938, he wrote a paper because the temperature had been increasing throughout the early decades of the 20th century. And he attributed it to, and it was a factor in the Dust Bowl, the great drought, he attributed it to greenhouse gases, to CO2. So an American engineer in 1930, he ignored it. We've known about, this is not as some right-wingers would have you believe, excuse my choice of that phrase, would have you believe. This is not some hoax dreamed up by Al Gore in his efforts to get elected to the presidency. Al Gore happened to have been a student at Harvard. He was in Roger Revell's climate class way back in the 1960s, and he knew about this stuff. It was one of his favorite subjects, a subject in which he had a great interest his whole career. So we as a people, we as a country have known about this for well over a century. What have we done about it? We've invested more in oil, gas, and coal. The fossil fuel industry, and we can understand why it is. And I'm being judgmental now because we know what's going on. We know what the impacts are. We know how many millions of people are being affected by this. Now there's no excuse. Earlier on, maybe we didn't know. But now we do know. And when you know something bad is happening, when you know that there's an intergenerational injustice, as James Hanson said, the greatest injustices in the history of the planet, when you know about it and you don't do anything about it, then you're responsible. We have got to get political this year and change this government, every state and federally.
Two or 3 months ago, I came to one of the meetings here, and I saw a video here that was quite intriguing. It was by Tony Seba from Stanford University. Are you familiar with him? Yes. And the program was basically that Dr. Seba has looked at price trends over the past decade or so of renewable energy and battery storage. And he's projecting with these price trends that there's going to be a crossover point coming up very soon where renewable energy and storage will be cheaper than electric generation from renewable energy with storage will be cheaper than coal and natural gas. And I think we've already reached that point. In fact, I just saw an article today that Xcel Energy has commissioned a project where they're looking at wind and with storage being, I think it was 2.1 cents a kilowatt hour, which is cheaper than coal generation.
Storage is the problem there.
this is storage.
They're looking at 2.1 cents per kilowatt hour with storage. And he's also, Dr. Steve was also projected that within the next decade or so, the price of electric vehicles will be cheaper than gasoline and oil-powered vehicles. And if that really is true, if that really comes to pass, then it would seem to me that would basically be a self-solution to the greenhouse gas.
No, it's not happening. We have no electrical infrastructure to support all electric cars. We've got to invest a lot in that, developing that infrastructure. And as I was pointing out, the present administration, the Trump administration, has taken off the bans and the holds on drilling offshore. As President Trump said, he said, as the developing world develops, such as in the southern hemisphere, they're going to need a lot of oil and gas, and their plans are to increase the production dramatically. Now the price may control it, but that's not what the government policies are. And remember, there are a lot of others. There are a lot of others who feel the same way. I mean, whose data show the same thing. We've got leaders in renewable energy right here in the state of Wisconsin, and that gives me an excuse to make an announcement. A week from Thursday, on January 18th, over in Madison at Monona Terrace, the organization called Renew Wisconsin, which is a great organization. It's the principal advocacy organization for renewable energy in this state. They're having their annual summit, Renewable Energy Policy Summit. It's $125 for registration, but I think maybe you can get in cheaper with the 350.org. But anyway, it's really a great conference. Here's the problem in Wisconsin. We've got one of these right-wing governments. Both houses of the legislature, the Tea Party came in 2010. Both houses of the legislature and the governor. And they don't want to do this. They're in the pocket of the oil companies. Why? The fossil fuel industries contribute a lot to their campaigns. That's why they're for sale. They're for sale. Our renewable energy portfolio standard, and I was glad to see that candidate McCabe is advocating 100% renewable energy. Our renewable energy portfolio standard, which legislates the amount of energy produced, generated by utilities from renewable energy, is at 10%. In other words, the utilities in this state are only required by law to generate 10% of their electricity from renewables. All the surrounding states here in the upper Midwest, it's much higher, 20, 25%. We haven't changed in 15 years. That's the job of the legislature. We're not going to make any progress in renewable energy, or I won't say that. We're not going to make nearly as much progress as we can and as we should unless we raise that renewable portfolio standard. And that's going to require a change of the legislature, probably a change of the governor as well. Greg?
2 points. This morning I'm listening to C-SPAN call and a guy calls up and says we need a fence on the Nevada-California border to keep the socialists from spreading.
Lloyd Wright up there, the developer and the promoter of Broadacre City, probably the worst thing to happen to transportation and to jack up gasoline and fossil fuel consumption. So I invite you to review Mr. Wright's participation in your slides.
The greatest tradition is change. And but thank you for that addition.
Okay. One more comment, and then I want to get into at least a few minutes. We got to be out of here by 8:30. One more comment. Why don't you stand?
Yeah, real quick, George. You out on the internet stories on the outside of the world, down in Australia, was 117 degrees right now. Yeah. The coal piles are catching fire. They're trying to put them out with water. They're running out of water. It's crazy.
I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to comment. I told Tom I'm glad it warmed up a little today. It's not so easy to talk about global warming when it's below zero, you know. But the fact is, the fastest warming area on Earth is the Arctic. And it's because primarily of a major feedback. As the ice and the snow have a white or a very light colored surface, act like a natural mirror, and they reflect a lot of the solar radiation back into space. That's the albedo effect, the amount of radiation that's absorbed. Well, the ice is melting because of global warming. The snow around the shores is melting in the Arctic. And so that exposes the darker colored water, the darker colored rocks and soil, and they absorb a lot more heat from the sun. So that's a positive feedback as a result of global warming, and that's the main reason that the Arctic is warming faster than anywhere else. And the sea ice is shrinking each year. This last September, when the minimum sea ice is reached, was the lowest amount of sea ice on record. So, but that has an effect. It pushes the cold air that was there farther south. They call it the polar vortex, a phrase that came into fashion a few years ago in meteorological circles. And the polar vortex is the reason we had that cold weather. So, as contrary as it might seem, or contradictory, our cold weather of recent years, although it's not nearly as much as it used to be. Our cold weather in recent years is attributed to the polar vortex, which is a result of Arctic warming.
One last question that I want to ask myself. Coming to these meetings like I do every month, you learn a lot. One of the things that we had, that was about 2 or 3 months ago, we had this video from a professor by the name of Ira McPherson. McPherson is totally pessimistic. He's given up his job at the college. He's doing his bucket list. He's maybe in his late 50s, early 60s. That's how he's saying 2026 is when we're going to start seeing real quick changes. That's how pessimistic he is. Okay. Are you familiar with that?
Oh, yeah, very much so.
And what's your thoughts on him?
Let me put it this way. Most climate scientists think he's way too extreme. Yeah, and that, saying that human beings are going to go extinct in 30 years, you can't sell that to anybody.
that gets to the point. You
Yeah.
can't sell that to anybody.
Well, there's no data to support it.
I understand. And the thing McPherson argues is that as the Arctic thaws, the methane on the bottom of the ocean, the Arctic Ocean, will start to come out. And methane is, my understanding, is worse than CO2 as far as global warming. I don't know.
Well, let me comment on that.
Yeah, do that.
There's a lot of methane stored in methane hydride crystals, which are in the ocean. They're not all the way down on the bottom. They're usually on the continental shelf. There's also a huge amount of methane potential in the tundra, all the way around the northern hemisphere, in Canada, the taiga, the great temperate forests. And north of that, where we have tundra, where it's all permanently frozen ground, permafrost, and that's melting. The tundra is melting. And as that organic matter melts, it starts to decompose. If it decomposes in the presence of excess oxygen, it will form CO2. If it decomposes in the presence of insufficient oxygen, it'll form methane. Now, so the thawing of the permafrost, the thawing of the tundra, is going to produce an enormous amount of methane. Now, you're right, and CO2. You're right, methane is about the estimates vary, 22 times more efficient, more potent of a greenhouse, of a heat-absorbing gas than CO2. But it has a short lifespan. Methane very soon oxidizes to CO2 in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, has an average lifespan of over a century. So the CO2 we're putting in the air now is going to stay there for a long, some for 1,000 years, some shorter. But the CO2 we're putting in the atmosphere, and that's there already now, you saw 407 parts per million, that's going to be there for a very long, long time. Whereas methane, thank God, has a short lifetime in the atmosphere.
We're running to the end of our time. We got to be out of here by 8:30. We got about 20 after 8. I hope that you will come back next time. We need to talk about where we're going, what we can do, what you can do and help us do, because it's not going to be just people like George who's going to be leading the charge. You have to be out there leading the charge. If you're not doing this, if you're not taking action, I mean, we need you to do this and come and learn more. One of the things we try to do at our 350 meetings is keep on providing information and new ideas. The whole the river in the oil spill and the creative damage that has been going on there. I think there's so many things that we learn, and we need to talk about the pipelines. The pipelines that are going to come right through the middle of Wisconsin. Right? The legislature has already, there's pipelines already. They have a right-of-way of 80 feet. Well, the pipeline companies want 200 feet. 200 feet wide of right-of-way through people's lands. You can imagine folks going through the middle part of the state, what they think about that. Good news and the bad news, in the tax bill, there, up to that point, there is a subsidy for putting renewables on your roof. They took it out. There's no federal subsidy, no federal tax credit. No encouragement to put up solar on your roof. Now, the good news is, guess who has really gotten involved in solar panels? Former Governor Tommy Thompson. He thinks there's money in there. And so he is one of the people now who is promoting solar panels. So keep an eye out for that kind of stuff. We'll have to see what the solar industry does, because there's more jobs in solar, putting on solar panels, than there are in coal mines. Yeah. Okay? So that industry, the solar panel industry, is going to be looking at how they can keep going. And I'm ready. I've got solar panels up already. And for what it's worth, in the end result, because of subsidies and all kinds of other support, it cost me about $6,500 to do that. Probably take me about 8 or 10 years to pay it off, but if I was doing it for my own self, it'd be one thing, but it's not. It's, as George said, what are these kids going to do? So getting close to 8:30 here. We need you to come next time so we can start talking about what we can do, what you can do, what you can help us do. Because George giving a great speech and everybody saying, oh, isn't that wonderful? And then everybody walks away and goes home. It doesn't do anything. We need to organize. We need to get together and figure out how we're going to do this. What kinds of things we can do, where we can make a difference in our community. You know, where you live. Those are things that got to happen. Where I live is in the city of Glendale, and the mayor there has made a commitment to do stuff. Well, maybe that's one of the things we can do, is start talking to the mayors if you live in other cities in our community. Let's start focusing on that, one of the options. The other option is, obviously, the vote is so essential. End run on that. If you're aware, there is a case before the U.S. Supreme Court on getting rid of gerrymandering. They were theoretically going to come up with something in January, but it was a Democratic, from Wisconsin, it was the Democrats who were doing this. There was a case going after the Democrats for doing the same thing in another state. And the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, is going to hear that in January. So it's probably going to be, but the implication of that is that they're going to do something about gerrymandering, okay? That they're going to take both cases together and then say, you can't do this, somehow or another. We'll see what comes out of it. But that's going to be pretty close to the 2018 election. And it's not going to change that election, or the way structures are, the way the votes are going to be there. We got to do it ourselves. We can't leave it up to them. Second Tuesday of next month, we need you to come back here so we can start planning more than just renewables. What other kinds of things we can do? Please come.